Signs by the road. The sorting hat and the yellow ball. On the origin of life and consciousness. L. 2304, 2024. Author's preface. Take a piece of paper. Do what you want with it. Document what you have done and contemplate upon it. Or not. If desired, send the documentation to the following ADR. Part 1. Chapter 1. What is consciousness? There are very few questions in this world that have puzzled mankind to such an extent as the one of the respective faculty. Throughout time, many efforts have been made in order to come closer to illuminating the boundaries of the contents embedded into the notion. However, this task has yet to achieve a sufficient degree of elucidation, as the ephemeral quality of the matter at hand is mirrored in the frequent resurgence of interest in the respective and reciprocal topics. The enthusiasm isn't unfounded at all, as it appears that the emergent phenomenon is the one of the clearly discernible parameters that readily defies the account of the world within the purely materialistic and mechanistic terms. If one is to observe the operational cogwheels of the universe, it becomes evident that there is more to the topic than what meets the eye, with the emphasis on the dimension of mystification that readily evades the grasp of scrutiny. The question that naturally occurs is, if the body is the machine recognized through and for its material quality, then how did the ghost emerge? Or better yet, was there a ghost there to begin with? Perhaps it is not consciousness that allures us. Perhaps it is exactly that connection to the intangible that tickles the back of the neck. That feeling and awareness of an unlocalized sensation, recognized within the domain of the perception, yet incessantly elusive as the locus of intrigue, clearly evades the classification within the tangible order. However, such viewpoint can as easily be an outcome of the conceptualized, understandings pertaining to the notion defined by the collective cultural output, as it can be an underlying function of the faculty in question. In and of itself, consciousness is no more and no less than yet another curious manifestation of the evolutionary process that, outside of the veiled domain it resides on, doesn't escape the fact that it is a product of the mechanism that has facilitated its emergence. Whilst its role as a tool pertains to the capacity to account for circumstances that define the subjective locus and act within the scope of navigational propensity, the essence of the phenomenon still seems capable of evading scrutiny. The more advanced we are as a species, the more it becomes evident that the reified materialization of participatory actuality is just an icing on a cake. There is still much at work at the fundamental level that is difficult to fully account for through the cognition and resources at our disposal. The more technological progress assimilates itself to the underpinning mechanisms that define the known universe, the more we are able to account for the origin of the capacity the world exists within. By glancing at the collective cultural output, it becomes quite evident that this question of actuality against the backdrop of the presented reality has always been a challenging one. The world is an oyster, yet the modalities it operates on are far too complex for human perception to readily account for all the presented intricacies. However, as it has become evident that there is more to the universal workings than what meets the eye, it appears that the consciousness as a faculty has proven itself to be the key to deciphering the underlying process that the world is perceived as a manifestation of. From the very onset, the question at hand has always presented itself through the complex network of exchange, where the particular placement of the manifested phenomenon poignantly encapsulates the peculiarity of its existence between the two dimensions, one that appears as easily discernible and evident to the most, and its counterpart which workings are still of a somewhat veiled character. This discrepancy in understanding is not simply a tale of the ages past, as even the times defined by global wakefulness and technological surveillance are still subjected to the same conundrum. Dichotomy has merely taken on a new suit. The human mind has from its very inception been able to account for causality. Our ancestors could, in the same manner as we can today, observe a connection between an arm and a bow, an arrow and its prey and the shelter and safety. They could also distinguish causality within the hierarchical order, evident through the traceable tokens such as various depictions and oral narrative, where the natural elements and unseen forces appeared like a puzzle of divine creation. Through many millennia of the evolutionary process, the human perception has by means of consistent refinement evolved from the most rudimentary state of perception towards the complex cognitive apparatus evident today. As humanity has through the above-mentioned means developed the capacity to account for the causal order ushering further cultivation of the cognitive spectre, a peculiar relationship with Mother Nature has been established. In one manner, the incessant attempts for elucidation of the encountered coordinates provided triumphant results, thus establishing a route and a pattern for further evolution. However, the other side of the coin was understanding that there was always a parameter or two that hindered absolute dominion of mankind on Earth. In many ways, the increasing complexity of understanding could also be one of the major instances of collectively apprehended cognitive dissonance anchored in a partial recognition of the men's supremacy, which was and still is running parallel to inevitable subjugation to the unforeseen forces. We, as species, have a distinct yet global tendency to mystify that which we can't understand directly, and consciousness as an emergent phenomenon readily falls within this category. Unseen yet affirmatively effective, subjective yet pertaining to the global, this ambiguous quality is exactly that which has granted the notion in question its mythical status and contributed to its frequent assimilation with the concept of the soul opening to its potential connection to the imagined divine. In many ways, it is this evasive capacity that appears to skip the successive chain of direct causality that serves as a token of the gaps within the current understanding of the fundamental mechanisms that define the embodied existence. By examining the narrative, even at a fairly superficial level, it becomes apparent that the emergent dissonance between the mystical, mythological and the clearly presented is directly correlated to the levels of manifestation within the material order. It is somewhat peculiar to think that what is unseen for the most part, still, remains discredited. As the saying goes, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. It is easier to hang a coat on the clearly visible hook than the one lacking clear tangibility. The same criterion applies to the instances one anchors systems of belief in. If one is to account for causality within any given set of parameters, a dimension where the affirmation of the exhibited relational character and preferably a tangible token of such are highly crucial to the amount of credence assigned to a particular phenomenon and/or to the respective chain of events. One can affirm that the arm that holds the bow and the one that releases the arrow are pertinent to catching the prey. One can also affirm that a material structure called a house is a place of safety. It appears that the tangibility of the involved criteria has throughout the human history been the faculty that reface the domain of apprehension within the collective and individual perception, and as long as the demand for the palpable is fulfilled, is proof enough of the interconnectivity within the dimensions in question. However, the task of establishing the associative reciprocity quickly becomes an obscure matter as the levels of tangibility or materialization fade from the respective horizon. There is a clear correlation between the levels of embodiment that define any given concept and its acceptance within the shared actuality. We accept that which is readily available and distrust the unseen. As such, the main question that emerges is whether intangible phenomena can be asserted to belong to the realm of the real to begin with. If the question doesn't necessarily pertain to the task of proving that anything like the above-mentioned exists at all, the lack of the clearly discernible appears to be subjugated to the extension of its presence within the material dimension. If one of the tasks is to attempt to provide a clear domain that outlines the phenomenon at hand, a form of retrospective tracing just might appear to be the best way to establish safe grounds to walk on. The peculiarity that emerges is in direct correlation to the fact that the faculty of consciousness is at its most evident readily accounted for not through what it is perceived as nor its manifestations, but to its appearance within the field of linguistics. If anything like consciousness has been recognized, then this pertains to an acknowledgement of particular sentiment or sensation that precedes its extension within the tangible order. In order to describe and mediate impressions, mankind has incessantly been attempting to approximate the inner experience and contextualize such through the means of establishing level of familiarity within the outlined content. As such, the linguistic domain doesn't solely exist on an autonomous basis, but adopts a role of a tool within its abridging capacity between the realm of perceptions and the invisible order and the tangible reality that it aids in manifesting. In essence, language is somewhat fascinating in this manner, as it plays a critical role within its mediatory amplitude as it navigates the domains of translation and assimilation that in turn provide respective meaning content defined by the illuminated scope. Regardless of the geographical disparities that account for the multiplicity of the linguistic branching, one can readily witness the concepts and inner workings that have come to define the particularities behind their individual evolution are of similar if not of the entirely same character. The matrix of development is somewhat universal, as every concept is defined by that which precedes it and as such acts as a unit of the constituents which it is a summary of. The same is applicable to the evolution of language and the terminology that defines it. It would be somewhat short-sighted to presume that a term is simply a term defined by a resolute semiotic content. Any occurrence, be it a material manifestation or unit of language, acts as a symbol of condensed historical narrative that has through means of sculpting and differentiation acquired its specific form. The same goes for the domain in question, as every word that has come into existence is a culmination of the content that has come to usher its existence. Thus, every instance that required specification has, within the domain of communication, developed, by the means of its own particular trajectory, into its specified term, pointing towards the established connection that defines the respective outcome. This notion, however, is a locus of dispute which naturally questions whether such is truly the case. For instance, there is no clear connection between the tree, sound, term and the arborescent structure encountered on a field, but it is difficult to wave away the proposition in its entirety. The lack of directly evident causality, or the lack in our means for accounting such, doesn't dismiss the established relationships that have emerged within the outlined domain. While there is a fixed level of mandatory accountancy that characterizes the relationship between the symbol and that which it symbolizes, the boundaries of implicitness are not always as clear and regulated by the surrounding content and context. The true peculiarity lies not necessarily in how the relational capacity has been established, but that there was something that has urged or ushered emergence of such to begin with. If one looks at the origins of language, it becomes fairly evident that the more something emerged with persistent frequency, as for example a reiterated subject or a particular phenomena, the need to anchor such within the domain of communication grew intact with the specified requirements. This brings one to the level of doubling and iteration, and lastly manifestation. Language connects and separates, it distinguishes and embraces, and naturally instigates. As a faculty of transfer, its capacity as an intermediary between differentiated instances allows one to connect across the previously unimagined scope. It has the ability to connect mankind with bids and flying with machines, and suddenly a plane has entered a shared actuality through the means of materialization, instigated by the potential for assimilating experiences. Who hasn't imagined having the ability to fly, an interconnectivity defined by the order of associations? And, the more a particular quality or instance is reiterated and amplified, the more it occupies the global domain of existence. The more something is repeated, the the more it is recognized within the particular framework where the emergence of the subsequent token acts as a confirmation of the territorialization that has taken place within the domain of the shared actuality, reality. This particular notion will be discussed a bit more in depth in the following chapters, yet the concept in and of itself is quite self-explanatory. As such, the term that has been assigned to the particular faculty also acts as a governing instance, token, that establishes the correlation of the surfacing sensation to its material manifestation. The question that naturally emerges is the one pertaining to the quality of the phenomenon that has surfaced through means of its specific linguistic signifier and as such anchored itself within the domain of represented actuality. We know that something like consciousness exists almost solely on the premise that the concept as it is recognized on the basis of its pre-established content has entered the domain of global recognition through the means of the word it has come to territorialize. Language is quite peculiar in that manner, as it adopts a form of router that exists on a plane of the intangible, spoken word, as it does within the realm of the materialized, written word, poignantly adopting a role of bridge connecting differentiated realms. Through such means it serves as a tool that allows one to retrospectively examine and contextualize a concept that has eluded mankind for millennia. If one is to attempt to come to terms with and to account for what consciousness is, one needs to account for both the individual and the collective factors that have come to define the faculty as such. Thus, the hope of gaining a kind of foothold potentially lies in the examination of the very term that anchors the phenomenon within shared actuality and through such means affirms its existence. A good place to start the investigation is naturally based in the analysis of the respective faculty and etymology within the provided framework. Perhaps somewhat unsurprising, what readily surfaces as one starts to discern the origins of the word is its roots in Latin, with connections to the ancient Greek, as the word shows itself as an amalgamation of a Latin word conscious, knowing, aware, and an assimilated form of com, with, or thoroughly. The Latin word probably is a loan translation of Greek sinidos. The question is, did this bring us any closer to uncovering the core of the phenomenon? However, what appears to readily emerge is an amusing dimension of incessant circularity as the very elucidation of the term, rather than providing a clearly differentiated account of what phenomenon is, appears as a translation that pertains to its synonyms with varying degree of overlap. Many bright heads have throughout history attempted to define the locus of the phenomenon that seems to have been defined by the same evasiveness as the one apparent today. As such, it becomes interesting to note that although the different cultures were as deeply enamored with the existential questions as we find ourselves at the present point in time, the term as such doesn't enter the discourse, or at least doesn't seem to be recorded with any notable frequency, until more recent history. Naturally, it would be a fallacy to infer a lack of interest in the subject matter by our predecessors, as the volumes left on the topic of metaphysical inquiry attest to the contrary. However, it is not wrong to ascertain that the present way of approaching the faculty in question is also somewhat neoteric. Whilst the discourse surrounding the particular field and its corresponding reciprocals, such as the one of the human perception, has always been present as recognized by the means of tracing literary output, one can with safely conclude that the requirements were not of such character as to lay the ground for the emergence of the term at that point in time. or at least not in a way that is supported by a transcript of it as such. It is first around the late 1600s that the term as one is familiar with today enters terminology with sufficient capacity, and with sufficient frequency for it to be recorded. If one chooses to believe the attainable exposition, it is none other than John Locke that has established the notion within modern context and facilitated its adoption into the intellectual canon by providing it with an adequate framework. This might appear to be somewhat odd, as one might conceive that the sans impression in question has existed in the past on similar terms as the one being accounted for today. However, it appears that whatever the case, the circumstances didn't usher for the emergence of such until Locke stepped forward. In his essay, Concerning Human Understanding, published in 1690, the philosopher defines the faculty as the perception of what passes in a man's own mind, a definition that later appears in Samuel Johnson's celebrated dictionary, 1755. From then on, the term doesn't simply rise in popularity, but quickly becomes somewhat of a globally discussed phenomena. Google may have a lot of fallacies, but it is a very useful tool when it comes to tracing etymology and interconnectivity across the global scale. As such, the graph provided by a simple search readily accounts for the number of times emerging frequency in available records, highlighting the exponential resurgence in recent history. This comes as no surprise. Whilst mankind has always been deeply enamored with the prospects for potential transcendence and has been looking for clues that would facilitate such, especially within a given set of topics, the recent reawakening of the global interest in the particular matter has brought about an entirely new approach to the once mystified domain. Naturally, this pertains in particular to the technological developments currently raging full speed ahead. As humanities have arrived at the center of one of the most important crossroads, the question of consciousness has moved away from its confinement to organic life forms and has initiated transcendence towards something else altogether. Going back to the initial task of attempting to pierce the heart of the matter that has baffled mankind for a very long time, and Locke's translation of the respective faculty, the inherent complexity of the phenomenon is starting to surface. If one observes carefully the particularities that have come to define and dominate the set of value judgments that have entered into the hypothesis, one might notice that its outline as the perception of what passes in a man's mind can be as simple or as complex as one wishes it to be. However, this goes for everything in this world, as such is readily defined and inherently connected to the body of attainable and attained knowledge, alongside the granularity of the individual understanding and the presented framework translated through subjective coordinates. The question that emerges is whether there is insight to be gained by examining Locke's proposition in further depth. Is the presented platter still worth entertaining despite its ancient provenance? Going back to the origins of linguistic theory and language itself, it is somewhat interesting to notice that every ascertained value judgment is defined by a set of words which do not solely act as carriers of information and subsequent meaning, but simultaneously embody the resonance and the assembly of the elements that have led to their specific emergence. When one speaks, or writes or thinks, employed symbols enter into a contingent relationship with each other, defining the system of meaning that emerges as a whole. Symbols morph and unfold within the resonance they entail, and how these are arranged and employed together depends on the circumstances of the content entailed in the narrative that the assembly in question is meant to convey. What surfaces becomes the symbolic representation of the contents that have come to define it. However, the depth of apprehension of such naturally pertain to the one that interprets. A cake is determined by the ingredients that have gone into its preparation, and whilst the end result is a triumph of unity, this is only achieved by the considerate arrangement of individual elements. As such, it becomes readily evident that although Locke's definition appears a simple one, its inner complexity is defined by the terms that have entered into it. Perception is on and of its own a tip of the iceberg, not very different from the notion we are attempting to unpack. It acts as a singular component, enjoying autonomy within the linguistic domain, Yet the very phenomenon it highlights exists within the inherent complexity as a concept defined by inevitable multiplicity. On one end there is the apparatus that perceives or has a capacity to do so, on another subject or object being perceived. This on its own entails a reasonable intricacy, providing the framework that defines it as the reverberation between 2 points becomes the source of infinite entanglement. To a certain extent it becomes evident that perception and consciousness territorialize similar planes of existence, as both enjoy multiplicity embedded in the very occurrence that defines respective faculties. Yet the question readily becomes whether their proximity is a gain or a hindrance when it comes to further elucidation. Thus their relationship and degrees of kinship might provide a form of insight into one another. However, whether the light that is being cast is of sufficient capacity to bring us closer to some form of conclusion is another matter altogether. Going back to Locke's definition, anchoring consciousness and perception into passing stands on equally troublesome footing. The verb clearly indicates movement, and as far as present knowledge stretches, movement is something that is attributed to a body defined by mass and its materialized content, something that consciousness, no matter how one looks at it, inherently lacks. The field of particle physics is neglected within this context. If consciousness is defined by perception with the capacity to move, the criterion of materiality is placed in an awkward position. Which brings one back to the discourse anchored in tangibility and the notion of the real. Until recent history, consciousness has been regarded as something belonging to the order of the ephemeral and has for many acted as a proof of Descartesian duality, separating the soul and the body into two distinct entities. However, the peculiarity of the matter becomes evident as soon as one starts to question its emergence at the very inception. What is certain at this point in time is that there is a designated term that defines a phenomenon that might or might not exist within the assigned framework, depending on the vantage point one chooses to anchor oneself in. Nonetheless, it is apparent that the term is a manifestation of the underlying experience that has been acknowledged as persisting within the individual and collective apprehension. The question that naturally comes along subsequently deals with the nature of presented experience being accounted for. A good place that can provide further elucidation is by establishing the domain of inquiry that allows for discernment of the sans impression that has ushered the manifestation of the term in question. If there is something like the phenomenon of consciousness, how can one infer its existence to begin with? How does one know there is anything like consciousness? By placing the subject at the center of the task of inquiry, one is coaxed into considering the particular state one finds oneself in. If the cognitive and corporal apparatus function adequately within the given framework, one will inevitably come towards the understanding that at the particular moment in time one is apprehending oneself as conscious, or at least the plane of existence is clearly pertaining to the set of qualities corresponding to the perception of the phenomenon. One will assuredly define oneself as conscious solely on the premises of having capacity to contemplate the presented state to begin with. However, the merry-go-round that pervades the field of inquiry has just started gaining its momentum. If consciousness is subjectively defined by the circumstances that allow one to contemplate its own existence, then that very notion and the state itself are from the very onset intimately tied to the concept of perception and awareness. Simultaneously, the faculty manifests itself and ushers its own accountancy through the very act of manifesting that which it signifies. Descartesian cogito ergo sum comes to mind as the underlying experience surfaces through the means of a subject that is able to infer one's own individual mode of being. In this manner one can ascertain to be in the state belonging to the respective faculty by the means of existence that can conceive of that which it is. If one conceives of consciousness, what one receives in turn is reciprocal feedback on and of an apprehended state through means of confirmatory awareness of the immediate surroundings and the self at the center. In other words, consciousness as a concept presents itself as discernment of differentiated content, where the apprehension of such is highly contingent upon the awareness that emerges from questions of the apprehended state to begin with. One can perhaps ask, if consciousness does exist within the material domain, does it do so through means of a router, in this case an agent, that is navigating such through means of extended action? In such a manner one can infer the existence of a state that ushers territorialization of its own capacity on the plateau of the tangible order. Any reflection upon the subject matter is readily presented through the convolution that inevitably highlights the loop at the heart of the process. Through means of further consideration, it becomes fairly evident that consciousness is in and of itself ungraspable for those that seek to apprehend it through means of anchoring in something concrete. Thus, in order to establish the existence of the faculty within the domain of the real, one does so through assimilation of parameters that have gone into defining the accounted state with the experience of a state that is being accounted for. However, if the existence of the respective notion is confirmed through the act of affirming one's awareness, this very occurrence subsequently ushers the need for further elucidation. Human body operates on the level of multiplicity, where the contents of its awareness are provided through the multisensory translation within the domain of exchange. The body is a complex machine whose existence is defined by apprehension and translation of inputs that define the function both on the level of global understanding and on the individual one, where the particularities translate into singular units delineated by the corporeal. The exchange that occurs on every tier of existence is also the one that defines the perception of the respective domain it operates on. One can't see, smell or taste consciousness, one can't discern its color, and one can't grasp it within the shared actuality. Yet the very notion is noticeably an active component in all the aforementioned tasks. Naturally, it becomes apparent that the levels of complexity increase as soon as one starts feeding this understanding into Locke's definition of consciousness. If consciousness is defined by perception, that passes the individual mind, and the perception is an umbrella term or a summary of the underlying process of exchange that defines every corporeal subject, then what does that say of the notion in question in and of its own? Up to this point, consciousness has been treated as a unified notion that enjoys autonomy within the outlined understanding. In many ways, this way of looking at the respective faculty doesn't defy the initial conceivement brought about by answering the question of one's own state of consciousness. By affirming that one's existence closely pertains to the respective phenomenon through the capacity of being able to contemplate such at all, the brain as an organ will without further complexity ascertain and affirm existence of the notion in question. However, the matter becomes a bit more complicated as soon as one starts asking the question of how one knows such is the case, how one knows that one is conscious. If simply inferring that something is happening is enough to confirm its existence within the defined framework, defined through means of cultural and individual output that has come to define the matter within the historical context, this world would be quite simple to account for. However, this is not the case. Thus, if one is to elaborate on the notion that pertains to defining the particularities that consciousness makes itself known through, the complexity of the inner mechanism and the steering cogwheels becomes readily exposed. Confirmation of consciousness is preceded by a vast amount of processes that through their peculiar mechanisms instigate a formational response. If one looks at the challenge posed from the purely mechanistic perspective, the agent that contemplates the respective faculty asks a question that after interpretation from multiple channels inherent to the body machine is informed on the matter through the means of the individual feedback loop. Interestingly enough, what clearly emerges is that one is swimming in waters governed by the translation and approximation of the subjective experience understood as such. However, the amount of instances involved in the process is so vast that the inner complexity entailed in any form of decision-making or undertaking is beyond the comprehension as presented to our compressed apprehension of actuality. Going back to the question of consciousness, it becomes apparent that our understanding of the subject matter is perhaps somewhat far from that which was initially conceived of. If consciousness is defined by the underlying apparatus that confirms and anchors such within the apprehended reality, the question of faculties' autonomy still remains. The more one looks at the above, the more apparent it becomes that this is the case of chicken or the egg paradox. As coming to terms whether one deals with a singular notion that emerges as unique faculty derived from all the process that has preceded it becomes increasingly difficult to answer. By conceiving of the term itself, it becomes evident that its presence is defined or rather supported by a wide range of derivatives or value judgments that have come to affirm the phenomenon through the very dimension that has ushered their particular existence. In such a way, any attempts to account for it within actuality have been made through means of investigating the relationship with the presented content and evaluation of experience that the agent in question has been subjected to, rather than attempting to discern phenomenon within its particular domain. If anything such is possible in actuality, that is, if the existence of consciousness is defined by the summary of value judgments anchored in the subjective experience and the underlying process that has come to manifest and interpret such, then the task at hand seems to be more convoluted than what was initially conceived of. The peculiarity of the process emerges as the doubling of the faculty in the realm of language is the one that adopts a role of main principle when accounting for the phenomenon as such, and which through the means of iteration within the spoken and written capacity adds the value of tangibility as an anchoring layer. By means of repetition, any faculty, not solely the one of consciousness, enters into the material dimension. The more something is repeated, the more it is recognized, and the subsequent territorialization that occurs within the actuality through means of doubling acts a token of realness, of existence of such. However, this is only one side of the matter. If one looks at it from another perspective, it appears that one of the features of the evolutionary process is of such character as to consistently extrapolate or come to conclusions based on the available parameters, and as such group these within the emerging structural hierarchy through means of a common denominator. Through such means, consciousness may appear as a unified notion due to the nature of human perception, language and historicity, yet the matter might not be as straightforward. If one observes the underlying mechanisms of human cognition, it becomes evident that the process operates on the scale of extrapolation and inflation, grouping and disparities. Simply put, there are many different varieties of trees, yet they are all organized and fall under the notion of a tree. Simultaneously, tree, as a universal concept, is subjected to expansion by being defined by many different types of trees. The same pattern is observable through both nature and the cognizing world. We extrapolate important points from a presentation and gather them under few main parameters, whilst simultaneously being aware that these can be expanded in whichever direction one might need through means of understanding of embedded implicitness. Through such means, the question becomes whether consciousness as such exists to begin with, or if it is a phenomenon which occurs through means of evolutionary and linguistic compression. To a certain extent, it is interesting looking at the evolutionary process from the perspective of compression and expansion. The granularity universe operates on surpasses human capacity for apprehension and understanding. Every living entity is a derivative of the process that has emerged within a certain specter of capacities peculiar to the species. Through such means, it becomes evident that every species is a sum of conclusions or extrapolations made by the underlying faculties that have ushered its existence. However, every entity or an assembly is also a router that conceives of its surroundings through means given to it by its corporeal manifestation, repeating the same process on and of itself. In order to survive, not all information is important, and the very means that discern such are the ones that have prevailed through the dimension of evolutionary differentiation. It seems that one of the features of the evolutionary process is of such character as to consistently extrapolate or come to conclusions based on the available parameters and as such group these within the emerging structural hierarchy. For example, in order to distinguish edible particles from the poisonous, one didn't need to understand all the informational granularity entailed in the interaction. Stipulations respective to the operational level sufficed. Thus, one could extrapolate that berries with distinct color had such and such character, and categorize their properties accordingly, subsequently avoiding harm and obtaining an overview over those within beneficial attributes. Thus, it becomes apparent that a gathering of multiple interconnected parameters under a fellow notion isn't solely a feature of the language, but the one directly intertwined with the evolutionary process. However, such forms of grouping can be as accurate as they can be subjected to fallacies if taken for granted. The term as viewed through the lens of linguistic means might just as easily have emerged as an technical or convenient umbrella term, rather than a mystified depiction or manifestation of an experiential state that humanity seems to be out of means to accurately account for. What might appear as a unified notion or a blank slate concept is in actuality the tip of the iceberg that entails a complex set of value judgments whose existence becomes visible solely through deeper examination of their operational underpinnings. Parts of the convolution entailed in the topic lie in the differentiation of the parameters and further implications embedded in respective outcomes of such extrapolations. Through the clearly apparent means, consciousness might appear as a unified notion due to the limits in nature of human perception, yet it quickly becomes evident that the matter is not as simple. One of the fallacies that readily emerge is tied to the historical outlook that anchors concepts into notions that, when left unexamined, yet appear sound on the surface, often become widely accepted as solidified axioms despite not being such in reality. If consciousness exists as a singular entity on a plane which isn't directly accessible through the means of and to human cognition, then the implications of such start to escalate exponentially. Further complications emerge if one considers consciousness within the above-mentioned boundaries, as the very postulate implies a level which is directly involved in the operational capacity of living subjects, yet its particularities are of unknown nature and lie somewhat hidden. Naturally, this extends further towards the understanding of an impact which resides beyond the plane of the clearly distinguishable and outside the reach of full accountability, spinning all the way towards the questions of soul and free will. It becomes evident that the more one gives thought to the matter, the more one finds oneself in the predicament of one's own making. The peculiarity lies in the fact that consciousness, regardless of its tangibility, might not exist at all within the predefined context. If one takes into consideration that existence of such might just as well occupy similar space as a, for instance, title of the book does, thus solidifying underlying contents into a singular unit in order to facilitate navigation within the domain of the representative. However, if one is to consider the faculty under the conditions that define it as a dynamic process, then the narrative starts to acquire a different tone. As most of the evidence suggests, Descartesian dualism and the concept of the soul are closer to figments of imagination than of the concepts that belong to the realm of actuality, as very little convincing proof has been provided in order to anchor such within the reliable. The same can't be said for the notion pertaining to consciousness, as past its form as a noun, its tangibility is anchored in the visible effects of its impact made apparent through the active state it manifests as an infinitive. Whilst consciousness isn't directly affirmable and can be a convenient, albeit a fictive faculty, its existence can be observed through the affirmative effects it has on the subject it belongs to and its surroundings. Consciousness, past subjective apprehension, occupies a space which, whilst not directly provable per se, is also measured through the extension of the created impact within the material order. In 1955, David Chalmers postulated hard and easy problems which respectively pertain to the nature of subjective experience and dynamics of informational processing within the domain of physiological exchange. Both propositions are intimately tied to the notions of dynamical transactions within the corporeal that characterize the faculty of emergence within the experiential domain. Through such means the very notion of consciousness takes a step back from its singular, noun, structure and transfers its agency to an active state embodied within its verb, form. It is rare to talk about the faculty outside the scope of its existence and perhaps impact, but discerning the state of being conscious of something appears to highlight the inner dynamic entailed in the process itself. What becomes evident by going back to Locke's definition, perception of that which passes one's own mind, is a higher level of synchronicity with the apprehension of the underlying sans impression that has instigated the emergence of the term. Finally, the notion becomes increasingly sensical as the infinitive that denotes the active state comes to the forefront. The question whether consciousness can exist as an autonomous proposition resembles, if not equals its existence with that of a concept of the soul, as a subjective faculty pertaining to the individual state of being. However, this can simultaneously imply that if one can do away with the concept of the soul, then the one of consciousness stands on similar footing. Naturally, this is more than apparent absurdity. The apprehension of the state of being conscious is anchored in the reciprocal dynamics that is described above stems from the notion of a subject with the capacity of awareness and perception and the state or phenomena that the subject is or becomes conscious of. Through such means the act of passing within Locke's definition doesn't pertain to a solidified notion or tangible manifestation, as in for example passing of a cup, but describes the exchange that occurs within the act of becoming aware and perceptive of something. Naturally, the puzzle that Locke's passing can refer to is a different matter altogether. However, within the scope of elucidation of the notion in question, the exchange that happens within the perceptive state is more than sufficiently encapsulated. What becomes apparent and to a certain extent reveals its inner peculiarities are the very dynamics that define the conversion of information taking place within the domain of the above mentioned. If one chooses to step away from consciousness as a state and focuses more on an act that it inherently describes, motion pertaining to the sequential succession across the temporal dimension, it becomes evident that there is more to the universal cogwheels than what is presented to one through means of its cognitive apparatus. Through such means, one can also ascertain the impact such establishes as the arrow of time acts as a vector where such succession and the imparted change is recorded. In such a manner it becomes evident that whilst consciousness lacks direct tangibility, its impact can be ascertained and even measured through various attainable means. Going back to the synonyms that have entered into its definition, awareness, perception, it becomes evident that the faculty is highly dependent on the active transactory state between two or several points. However, the question that emerges is the one of its connection and reliance on synonyms during examination. One might be inclined to ask, what is the difference between various signs that altogether stand on almost equal footing? What is the difference between awareness, perception and consciousness, as all are defined through the various faculties of exchange taking place between the domain of apprehension, recognition and, individual, sensitivity? A common denominator between the differentiated instances is that they all exist on the autonomous plane, perfectly standing all alone as they exist as an intermediary between two or several concepts. Whilst awareness and perception might stand on the above footing, consciousness might be an exception, albeit not a readily apparent one. If one examines, awareness and perception are equally involved in the respective states they are describing. One is or becomes aware, perceives something, and the knowledge is retained within the temporal span of recognition. The common denominator is anchored in informational capacity that transpires between both processes. To be aware falls under the domain of cognizance and information, to perceive stems from Latin and is rooted in understanding. In both cases, the temporality of the prospect is defined by the object or situation entailed in the transactory state that transpires within the moment of apprehended knowledge. Consciousness, on the other hand, appears to territorialize a different dimension which isn't as readily available on the surface. Going back to the etymology of the word itself, its direct interpretation pertains to a format that reads, with knowledge. Most of the early transcripts tackle translation within the context of sharing knowledge with someone, however that is only one of the plausible meanings. Whilst there are many various interpretations of how, with knowledge, is to be accounted for, a possible dimension that has been almost entirely eschewed is the one pertaining to the navigational potential embedded in the faculty of, with knowledge, as the provided translation. This might be purely speculative, however, if awareness and perception are directly linked to the changes manifested after such has come to pass without further implications defined by the term such experiences territorialize, consciousness can be a faculty that is on the individual basis linked to the subjective navigational capacity. In such manner, with knowing, or, with knowledge, isn't solely defined by the occurrence circumscribed by awareness or perception, but entails a dimension of incessant calculation within the scope of evolutionary succession. Whilst this might appear somewhat challenging to absorb as very few if any have made similar propositions, consciousness as a faculty, or better yet the active state such proposes might have a role in the above-mentioned, thus separating the notion from its synonyms. Of course, this is a matter of pure theoreticizing. However, if knowledge is attainable through means of recognition of the content that defines such, it is important to note that terms and concepts are defined by that which precedes them and as such exist as amalgamations rather than autonomous singularities. One of the many aspects that contribute to mystification of the concept, especially within the domain of common perception, is intimately connected to the assimilation of such within the idea of the soul. Perhaps it is easier to answer the question of what is entailed in the concept of the soul than the one of consciousness, where the point of overlap is naturally pertaining to the immaterial aspect anchored in one's individuality. A soul is considered a unique attribute tied to the particular body and as such defines the individual and its actions. As such, it serves as its resonance, decision-maker and a compass, something that has capacity to travel, absorb, morph and move with the potential to enrich and enhance itself and the possessed body. Within such means, soul is thought to possess the ability to guide the entity which it belongs to and aid in maneuvering one's existence. If one looks at it from the perspective as described above, the perception of the tasks pertaining to the soul do not seem too far from those attributes often assigned to consciousness. One might be inclined to ask whether consciousness performs tasks at all, given that task implies goal-directed intention, but the role of an active state of being conscious of implies a calculatory domain of informational exchange. Simultaneously, consciousness isn't removed from its material point of origin, namely the body, as such is readily involved and even acts as a field where the above-mentioned exchange takes place. Through such means, consciousness can presumably adopt capacity similar to the compass, which within the context of evolutionary process has the possibility of becoming a tool within the operational scope, with the capacity to steer development within the material domain. By increasing the amount of knowledge within the subjective context, every change that occurs through means of enhanced awareness and perception becomes an augmentation along the sequential axis governed by the arrow of time. Whilst the faculty per se is of such nature that it lacks direct tangibility, the way it is possible to ascertain that something like consciousness exists outside the domain of human sans impression is through its extension within the dimension of material manifestation. This aligns with the prospects of navigational capacity, as every alteration of perception that inherently changes a part of subjective behavior and retains its position on the specter of conscious act will sooner or later bring about effect in the material domain. It becomes quite interesting observing the closure of the loop as through, with knowledge, becomes a faculty that has the capacity to recognize itself for that which it, mostly, is, and through such means manifest itself within the presented actuality. This is correlated to all sorts of tasks and behavior patterns, from the ones with grand implications to the menial ones, simultaneously involving those on the other side of the corporeal barrier and one's own perception of oneself. Through such means consciousness, tied to subjective self and guided by perceptiveness, has capacity to attain a role of an eternal calculator that through means of informational exchange acts as tool within individual navigation. In such manner awareness and perception, anchored in their respective roles of assimilating the sensations in accordance to and with the corporal, become the root or the knowledge embedded in consciousness that completes the loop by employing the dimension of within its existential propensity. In that manner, the potential embedded in the respective faculty recognizes itself through the various parameters that have entered into it and adopts such as a form of self-recognition within the evolutionary domain that stretches across the temporal scope. At this point in time, this approach might appear closer to the philosophical speculation dominated by dissemination of language and common practices entailed in human behavior. But this is only one of many propositions that the future chapters are set to tackle and cast light on through means of examining further peculiarities of existence in hope to illuminate and connect various domains